Okay, so welcome back. The last big session of the conference is taking place now this afternoon, and it's a panel discussion. And this is a session I'm really excited about, and it's a case of collaboration. It's a co-production with the boss, Ramon Sangüesa, and La Mandarina de Newton. So I'm not going to introduce him again, and he'll do the honors of introducing all the speakers this afternoon. So I leave you with them.
Okay, thank you. I never been introduced as the boss, but well, okay. I accept it for a while, but just for a while, okay? Well, thank you for coming. I think we have a very interesting lineup of members of the panel. I will introduce them later, or I will let them introduce themselves later, right? Which I prefer. So I just want to share with you the motivation of this meeting, right? When the organization of the Open Design, Shared Creativity conference approached us at La Mandarina Newton, they asked, what are you thinking or what you're doing these days that you would share with the people attending this meeting? Okay, as sometimes we try to define ourselves at La Mandarina as a transformation agency, which in a way is a way of just getting out of the typical classification so they can do more or less different types of approaches to different types of projects. So, and one of the things that we've been involved always with is science and technology projects, science and technology communication about these projects. And along the years, we've been developing a kind of very critical attitude towards the way that these aspects are communicated. And this is why slowly we just integrated participatory and open design approaches and methods to actually create some different types of products, services, and projects around the impact of science, so that people could appropriate that. That was one of our threads of work. And in due time, we also realized that from the design side, there were some types of approaches that were apparently very good to, let's say, understand or to provoke some kind of discussion about wicked problems that were created by technology development or by science development, or that you could, in a way, foresee happening in a horizon of several years. Right? So that's why we turned to critical and speculative design. But again, because our initial interest is just by letting people appropriate the projects, we were thinking, on the one side you have critical and speculative design methods that typically are seen as something as that's the result of someone highly skilled abilities, highly skilled, a long experience in design, and something that is very idiosyncratic, becoming almost sometimes a way of expressing, but nevertheless very powerful as a way to create powerful conversations, to, let's say, foster ambiguity, to not giving closed solutions, and to really spawn discussion. And on the other hand, you have the people that could really get to know things by actually doing things together. So the question that we were asking when Viviana approached us was how we can merge both things together, right? How we can play with, let's say, plain people with a critical design attitude, so they actually create critical design projects in a participatory way. And as we usually do, we created our own inner research line about these topics. We are still on it, right? Because we are not clear yet about the final outcome, that's why we proposed this session, actually to openly discuss with people with lots of experience in these different areas how this could happen and if it could happen, right? So that's what we are going to talk together during this panel session, and we are going to see different aspects of critical and speculative design, also participatory design, and we'll try to come up with questions that could just begin another type of conversation with a wider community of design here, and we hope that it's useful for all of us. So we created, if you want, with this panel, a first probe about this problematic area of collaboration, right? So we are together here with Lisa Ma, which she will introduce herself when it comes up here, Luiza Prado, Pedro Oliveira, and Laura Forlano. Just to give a hint from my point of view, Luiza is a practitioner of critical and speculative design. She will add more details about that. Luiza and Pedro have come up with a lot of impact with their publication of Where's the Critical in Critical Design article in Medium. And Laura Forlano, we've been collaborating with her for long. She has done a lot of work now in the Illinois Institute of Design in Chicago with her students about mixing precisely participatory and critical design and speculative design approaches. So, with much further ado, I will give the word to Lisa Ma, please.
Oh, let's have the film. Can you help us play it?
To save this idea of nature.
No. Can we have it play back again, please?
As a result of
No. Right. Can we have it playing back, please? Hey.
How much of your tax money is used to kill animals in your own city to save this idea of nature?
I see it as a kind of process. As a result of these species which are entering here, that they can become very dominant, and they can, because of this dominance, they can also have all kinds of new problems. They are opportunistic animals, meaning that if they have not much competition, that they grow very quickly.
Diversiteit. Ze vraagt bij zo'n als ja, ik vind dat dat een vonnis van dat er altijd diversiteit is van verschillende hier zo.
So, hello. I'm Dick Lisa. Yeah, I'm not going to say the whole thing in Catalan. My name is Lisa Ma. I'm what someone would call as a speculative designer, but my job is actually about designing dilemmas. And I basically take people on a journey of asking questions around a contradiction between what people do and what people believe in. So today I'm going to use this opportunity to explain how design can actually take us and move us from a state of possibly passivism to a state of activism. And I hope the results are going to be a very different kind of activism than what you might expect. So a couple of years ago, I went to live inside a joystick factory in China. I wanted to understand how the Eastern factories were reacting to this fast pace of innovation cycle that we're so proud of in the West. And after observing the factory workers, I realized that these guys that make our gadgets used to be the farmers that would have made our food. So I started asking, well, who's making our food now? So I went to the factory bosses and I persuaded them to let the workers do part-time farming alongside production in order to survive these technology renewals. And I call this farmification. And through farmification, a global dialogue about how our technology demands were having a real-life impact on the world food economy. And very soon, iron factories and construction industries that suffered also a lack of demand started to apply it. And farmification began spreading as a quiet form of activism. So what you're seeing here is an abandoned theme park being reclaimed back quietly by the local villagers. This is really interesting for me, because in a country where activism is so heavily punished, I began to study why these forms of protest were evolving in order to avoid raising flags. So in farming, simply adapting to the market for individual survival, possibly a passive activism happens. This emergent pattern makes a statement indirectly without a voice of conflict from the doer, but of against importation, against dependence, and against this trend of being over-specialized. So this is Shanghai Airport, where I was really surprised by how the security team had allowed a demonstration to happen. But when I started to look at it, really, the guys were sort of just doing knitting and sewing shoes, doing repair works, even babysitting. And could it be that the productivity of getting on with these errands were actually reducing aggression, reducing conflict? And they were reminding maybe even the most hard-nosed security guard that they're just the same people getting on with everyday life. So they were being more relatable. So we've come a long way since the olden days of traditional ways of protests and rioting, thankfully. But the activism we know is still too loud. With technology, it's too easy to gain that high visibility. We've got these terms like clicktivism and slacktivism, for God's sakes, armchair activism even. And the thing is, it can be a bit too shallow. We're not really fully engaging. And maybe it's too noisy. It's desensitizing us, and it's drowning out all the other interesting voices. And it's cliched. So I'd like to talk about an opportunity for activism to be more passive and compassionate, to be deep, to sensitize us, and to offer more diverse voices. So going back to that question that we nearly missed out, what if your tax money was being used to kill animals? Believe it or not, I post this to a town that's called the vegetarian capital of Europe, in Ghent in Belgium, where every Thursday, shops and restaurants would literally exchange their meat products to have vegetarian or animal-friendly alternatives. And being a vegetarian here is really a status symbol of active citizenship. Obviously, I went there and presented a very animal-unfriendly problem, the invasive Canada goose. Now, imagine these huge birds as flocks of multiplying bulldozers. What they're constantly doing is pushing the soil into Ghent's canals and literally blocking the drains of a city already below the sea level. These geese had to go. In this politically vegetarian town, though, there's a secretive government program to solve this. Every year, thousands of invasive geese are killed. They're caught by man force. They're individually injected. I mean, imagine you're holding down this big animal that could literally break your arm, and you're trying to inject a poison syringe into it. And then you've got to wait for the animal to die and lug it back to be incinerated in the thousands. It's a really, really costly procedure. So in 2013, I went to stay in Ghent to build relationships between the scientists, the chefs, the ecologists, politicians, and the local vegetarians to explore this clash of values between the killing of animal for our city and the killing of animal for our foods. In a town that takes pride in the values of animal friendliness, putting a goose on the table is really a tool to explore new forms of activism. Ultimately, the challenge this step was, how do I get different communities to really care about one thing together? So a year on, my little provocation about eating an invasive animal actually boiled into an urban movement with startups and competitions and TV programs, all about using invasive species as raw materials, and then in a bigger scheme, looking at what's termed as invasive in the first place. And we'd organize these tours and meetings so that the policymakers in Flanders were almost forced to learn from the local foragers that were doing it partially legally to really, boil down this very stagnant convention of expertise in the academia world. And we also wanted to, Lorne and I talked about this, challenge this idea of sensationalist view about what's good and evil in terms of this word invasive species, and this feeling that as a scientist you have to demonize invasive animals in case people are going to empathize with it. So I'm talking about a space where people can both empathize and then think about things without the sensations of it all. And we are publishing science journals as well that were presented in these ideas to confront that notion. And what you're seeing now is a collaboration between restaurants and extermination companies. So this is a cake being made in a very nice store called Julie's House. You should all go there. But cakes being made out of the invasive Japanese knotweed. If you know anything about invasive species, basically these are like the worst plants you could have in Europe. They're like zombie plants. So even a little cut stem would grow into a whole colony. And they're essentially the zombie stuff, and you have to burn it up. So I thought, well, you know, cooking is probably a bit better than burning. And luckily, they taste like rhubarb, but without the laxative quality. So we created a demand, essentially, for local invasive delicacies. And this process really also shone light that we didn't expect on the community, the systems, the finance, the politics that we take for granted in the background of maintaining this ecology of a nature-loving city. And it really highlighted the level of technocracy that we experience in the everyday biology and ecology hidden in the background of natural living. So what you're seeing here is invasive goose eggs being collected, but they would have otherwise been thrown away, and they're being served as vegetarian food. This idea about designing around a dilemma, really around how we feel and act towards animals, is resurfacing this clash of values between what we do and what we believe in. So if you think about it, vegetarianism was a form of activism, but what now when it's become assimilated? And I propose that we consume invasive species to control rather than leaving the responsibility to governments that poison. So to celebrate it, I got to feed the mayor of Ghent an invasive Canadian goose.
I hope he understands that this actually has a lot of political significance. Also, the fact that if you directly eat these, you're not really having to pay food taxes, you're not having to pay environmental taxes, and he's giving it permission through his one bite.
And you say that we can eat them?
I say that you can eat them.
Well, I think it's a very good idea because it's almost the same that we are doing in the city of Ghent. But we always say that it's not enough to be a smart city. Your citizens have to know what you are doing in the city. So the citizens has to be taking part of everything that's happened in the city. I'm going to taste it. You promise me I don't want to get sick.
Yes, I promise.
Mm-hmm. It's not bad, eh? Not bad at all. I don't know how to catch a goose, but we can organize it. Why not?
Thank you.
Okay, Q&A will be at the end of the different interventions here. So now I invite Luiza and Pedro to start their own presentation.
So, hello, we are Luiza, Prado, and Pedro Oliveira. We usually go by as a parede, and we're both PhD candidates at the University of the Arts in Berlin. And our researches are funded by the Brazilian Council for Research and Development. And we wanted to pick up on what was already presented here, and we'd like to talk a bit more about speculative design and the problems that we see in the discipline in its current state. So the idea for speculative design, to give you a little bit more of a background, it was introduced about 15 years ago in the UK, and more specifically at the Royal College of Art in London. And critical design, as it was known at the time, was conceived as a response to affirmative mainstream design, which is its aim was to provoke critical thought on the role of designed objects in everyday life and to question how the design process situates itself within the status quo of modern capitalist societies. But how critical is this critical design? And so to begin exploring this idea, we'll have to go back a little bit first in order to understand where the discipline comes from. So speculative design owes many of its ideas to critical theory, which was a philosophical movement first formulated at the Frankfurt School by people like Adorno or Horkheimer or Marcuse, Habermas, all those European white men that look exactly alike. They do, look at it. And the idea was to enlighten the masses and to offer critical assessments on society and cultures and underlying structures of power, right? And I mean, it is a good proposal, but it goes without saying that the Frankfurt boys here, they were quite patronizing and arrogant. I mean, once again, rich white European men felt entitled to say what others should or should not know or do or think. So there has been some denial of this proximity between, I'm going to call it SCD from now on, which stands for speculative and critical design. It's like easier. But there's been some denial of this proximity between SCD and critical theory, but the influence of critical theory in SCD is quite evident. Yeah, I mean, these quotes pointed out quite clearly. Dunn and Raby are kind of the creators of the whole thing, and their language is clearly influenced by critical theory. They have similar origins, similar language, similar goals, if you look at it. So we know that all this talk of SCD kind of sounds a bit abstract when we just describe it with words. So we brought a few examples to show a bit better how critical and speculative design is supposed to work. For instance, in this project, the folks at the Green Isle, which is a studio based in Berlin, they have created this collar that tightens every time one's phone rings. So the idea of this project is to provoke reflection on our weird and ambivalent relationship with communication devices. In this other project, Auger and Loiseau, which are a studio based in London, they explore the possibility of using smell to identify a suitable partner. So they created the scenario where two people would smell each other while separated by a wall. I think the wall is visible here, right? And it's kind of a smell blind date. And lastly, this project by Jamie Pike, it starts from the idea that in the future we will all live much longer. And she starts from the idea that we'll live like to 150, for instance. And it explores how this would change how families are structured. So the idea is that families would be formed by contracts which end after some time. So this photo here depicts the lady there issuing her death notice for that family because her contract has ended and she gets to move on and go somewhere else and perhaps live with another family in a different position in the family. So this idea of SCD definitely sounds super bold and exciting and ambitious, but as we got to know, Pedro and I, when we got to know the field, we were actually a little bit underwhelmed. And why is that? And actually, we were underwhelmed because we thought that SCD usually falls so short of these critical aspirations. For instance, critique actually seems to be more of an intellectual exercise than a real effort to discuss some serious problems in society. And I'm saying this because the thing is, if you want to question the status quo and provoke and reflect on design's role in society, you necessarily need to acknowledge and address certain issues of social justice, like gender and race and ability and class. And unfortunately, most of the production in speculative and critical design is ignoring these issues in favor of some very narrow and privileged ideas of what critical could mean. I mean, of course, you have different projects that really do tackle these questions, but unfortunately, they're still the minority. And we see that the biggest problem right now in speculative design is twofold, actually. Not only it hasn't really dared to take this proposal for critique a bit deeper, but also it seems to have decided to depict its futures from a very narrow perspective. And if you look at a wide range of speculative design projects, you will notice that, for instance, most people depicted are white and implicitly European, and couples and families are always based on a traditional heterosexual model, for instance, in Jamie Pike's project. And the lifestyle of middle and upper classes seems to be the norm, apparently. And even the visual language of the discipline tends to borrow the vices of other disciplines like fashion photography, for instance, which for me becomes very evident when you notice that women in particular seems to be always depicted to a certain beauty standard in SCD projects. So SCD ends up operating from this very narrow and normative depiction of everyday life, and one that unconsciously reaffirms our current status quo instead of questioning it. So minorities in their futures, in those futures, have no space. They don't take part of the conversation. So if critical design aims to question the status quo, it has to be bold. It has to approach complicated themes. It has to ask wicked questions. It must deal with these issues of social justice. And yet, most of the production in the last 15 years has ignored these issues in favor of what some people recently have started calling first world problems. There's even a hashtag for it. So now Pedro will tell you a bit more.
So it becomes really clear that speculative and critical design, they have kind of inherited the critical theory patronizing stand. So they operate basically from this entitlement and privilege point of view of the white academic middle-class designer from the developed world. And this designer usually is either unaware of or doesn't care about realities different, that are different from their own. Sorry. So this doesn't mean necessarily that SCD is ill-intentioned, but it does mean that we have a very serious problem of privilege and entitlement permeating the discipline. The privilege and entitlement is a general problem in design discipline altogether, but in speculative and critical design, which aims to actually ask these questions, it seems to be a very specific problem and very problematic. It's something that's bound to happen in disciplines that are developed in the safe confines of academia and expensive universities in North in the northern countries, Northern Europe and the US. So as Luiza said, when we started our masters back in 2009, we were very excited about speculative and critical design. But as we started looking and researching more in the field and actually getting to do stuff, we were a bit underwhelmed. And so while we did our MA thesis in 2012, we briefly tackled and delved with some of these representation choices, which was what was concerning us at the time, is those choices of representation and depiction of the futures. So we decided to tackle that very briefly. So for instance, in this project, we didn't, the themes of the project did not necessarily tackle these questions directly, but our choice of the documentation reflected these concerns. For instance, this project talks about the way we relate to one another in a romantic relationship in the future, and we have purposefully decided to depict a homosexual couple. So this is the objects. You can check. I mean, I won't go deep into what the project is about. I don't think it has to do with all what we're talking about here necessarily, but you can check later on the internet. Also, in the other project, we were talking about obsession with music and obsession with live performances and all this audiophilia kind of realm, which is a very male-oriented field of sorts. And then we decided purposefully to depict only women dealing with audio issues. So all of our sound freaks are not men. We know, I mean, it's not something very groundbreaking, but it's subjectively, it's there that it should be depicted in a different manner. And also, like, the conscious choice of not using European, necessarily only European people. So, even though we made those conscious decisions with regard to how we wanted to portray our subjects, our MA projects that I just show here, they employ this language of the first wave of speculative and critical design, which stems from the Royal College of Art. And right now, it is exactly these details and concerns, that very specific language of the RCA that we are concerned with right now. So this is a very tangible example of it. This is from Dunn and Raby, as Luiza said, one of the canons of the discipline. So this is from their most recent book, Speculative Everything. And they call it the cone of future projections. This is not a creation of them. It's actually very used in speculative and critical design conversations. It has been largely used, and it's easily reachable on the internet in various depictions, but this is the most recent one. So I think it is a very useful graph, in a sense, because it shows how futures can be designed. So you have the possible futures, the plausible futures, the probable futures, and the preferable futures. So, and while I think it's and Dunn and Raby do that, I think it's very valid to question whose preferable future are we talking about. They let one very, very, very important detail in this cone miss. We are not in the same present. I think if you ask any South American, any Middle Eastern, any African person, you will notice that our dystopia is happening right now. We have seen a myriad of speculative and critical design projects that question what-if questions, such as what if we lived in civil war, or what if we suffered food scarcity? But bear in mind that this is not a what-if question in many, many, many places of the world. It is daily life. The dismal futures developed countries fear so much are in fact our dystopian presence. And it is exactly this ignorance of the world around them what makes the current status of speculative and critical design very dangerous. On one hand, it's fair enough that they should concern themselves with their own reality and problems. This I'll give. But the questions being asked most of the time show that there is a lack of acknowledgement and empathy to whatever is out of the very narrow reality. Not because they should come and help us, like sometimes they think they should, but rather because they are ignoring that there is an entire world below the equator line, as well as to the right of Germany. The few projects that address these issues usually incur in the very colonialist mentality of being the savior of a population that supposedly cannot solve their own problems. No. What designers need to do is just stop and listen. Instead of designing for them or even with them, designers need to understand their perspectives and, more importantly, let their voices be heard. And with these women, also minorities who are oppressed due to sexual orientation, gender, race, class, and so on. We, as designers, do not have the right to speak for others. We have to make these design spaces open enough, comfortable enough for these discussions to take place. So, as Ramon said in the beginning, in February this year, Luiza and I, we wrote a text addressing these questions, and surprisingly enough, it resonated a lot. Apparently, we put in the form of text, in a critical text, if you want to call it, well, lots of people had in mind already. So speculative and critical design has a huge privilege and entitlement problem, and it must be questioned, bashed against the wall, and addressed critically right now. So you can find the text easily everywhere. It's on Medium, just Google it. So the story cause in the community is a clear evidence that things must change, and I think that's exactly where we are standing right now. So it's a very crucial moment in which speculative design must question its own language as to evolve. So this is our current effort in the moment. It's called Design in Times of Crisis. It is a scenario we are designing based on observations of the current dangerous situation happening in Brazil right now. Not only the World Cup protests, as you may be aware of, that are taking place under massive police and state violence, but there is a very strong right-wing, radical Christian conservative movement taking place in Brazil right now that put all the rights for women, non-normative folks, and other minorities at enormous risk. So in order to tackle some of these questions, we have started collecting some evidence in a blog, which is Design in Times of Crisis on Tumblr. And back in April, we went to Brazil, and there we held a series of workshops addressing this scenario. So we were talking about what issues are at stake right now in Brazil and how speculative and critical design could work for the benefit of a good way to overcome this scenario, at least survive it. So we did three instances of this workshop. One at a university, the other at an NGO, and the last one at a design studio. So by showing Brazilian designers a way to reflect on how their presence are a threat, they now have a powerful means that uses a language that they are familiar with, that of design, to question, investigate, and speculate on their own futures. And we hope to see this practice reflected in their upcoming projects because they can truly be the voice of a change. For instance, I think I'll just show briefly one of our favorite projects that came from this very, very short workshops. A few of the students played with the idea of this gender normativity control in the form of a pill that resembles Ritalin, so that you have to take every day. So the idea is that you would actually forget or adapt to some normativity standards of society regarding your own questions of sexuality, gender, and etc., and other forms of oppression. So they decided to depict the square folks, and this guy is going to become one of those squares. I think it's a very interesting question to be asked. Other people suggest an algorithm that could learn strategic movements of riot control police to propose alternatives against police violence. And another group of students tackle the spread of sanitary diseases by creating a caste system for living laboratories, which is a very, very creepy scenario. So like they would divide people into castes and they would become living laboratories for the test of certain diseases and immunities. So all in all, our biggest question to the discipline right now is whose voices are taking part in this conversation and whose are being left out? How do we include these minorities that are living these dystopian presents and hear their voices? And how do we let their visions of near futures and immediate presents be the central role of a speculative project? And more importantly, or making more akin to the very theme we are discussing here at this conference, how do we turn critical and speculative design into a meaningful and truly open conversation? Thank you.
also on Twitter about this subject. So we propose you to use a hashtag which is critical open, right? Critical open all in lowercase and without space. Critical open. No space and lowercase. Okay. So now it's the turn for Forlano.
Okay, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I especially thank the FADfest and La Mandarina de Newton for organizing this panel, because I think it's a really important conversation at many design schools around the world as to how do we integrate the various traditions of design, whether those be more psychology and experimentally based, or more field research based, or more art based. You know, all of these things are happening in different schools and different design practices, and so I think this is a really great discussion to be having today. So I'm trained as a social scientist, and I've been working in design schools for about 8 years. So what really excites me the most about the potential to join co-design and critical design is the tension and the friction in between the different methodologies and practices. And I think over the last 2 days, we've heard a lot about kind of a new set of hybrid spaces that we are living in and working in. And I would say that these are the points of tension between the critical and the generative, the open and the closed systems, the digital and the material, which we heard so much about today, the role of experts and that of amateurs, consumers and producers, ownership and sharing, private and public. So many of the new processes and new companies that we are talking about at the conference are somehow working at the edges of these different, hierarchies and hierarchies and sort of opening up new spaces. So we might think of those spaces as the place where these conversations are happening. So what I'm going to do is just show a couple of examples from my own research and also from that of my students that try to marry some practices from participatory and co-design with critical design and sort of what I've learned for the process. So I've been running co-design and participatory design workshops for the last 3 years. And I have to say that unlike my original expectations, moving from an ethnographic or qualitative research-based process and towards one that involved the facilitation of workshops as a design research process, it's not about everyone agreeing and collaborating in a smooth way, actually. It's not. So the first one I held was actually at the Center for Social Innovation in Toronto, and what I found there is that the participants in the Center for Social Innovation, which is a co-working space for nonprofits focused on environmental and arts and education activism and social change, we're talking about a very serious analytical bunch, and so introducing design methods was quite tricky because when you propose, for example, things like role-playing as a mode of discussion or body storming or some of these kinds of more performative modes, it's very difficult for someone who's kind of coming from under a lot of time pressure to raise money for their nonprofit, to get things done, to spend the time in what seems like a kind of frivolous activity. And so very quickly, we get faced with the question of what is the point of this? Well, why are we here? Why are you spending our time? And so it took, about an hour to bring the conversation back around where we could start to do something that, involves some very basic design methods like putting our ideas out on paper and sorting those and clustering them in front of a group, and for them to see the value of visualizing their ideas rather than just debating or keeping everything in language or in spoken word, and moving that into something that could be visualized in space, and that did change the dynamic of the conversation. But again, this was one of the frictions or the tensions. You can't expect that these things are going to go easily, or and it takes a lot of time and effort to effectively curate and facilitate the right kind of interactions in those processes. The next example is the open design for organizational innovation, and this was essentially trying to bring the two communities that I participate mostly in, which is social science and design, together around the St. Nick's Alliance, which is a community organization in Brooklyn that provides a lot of social services like benefits for homeless and child care and arts programming in Brooklyn. And so this one was mostly about translation of skill sets across social science and design. And what we first did is sent the participants out on an ethnographic observation of the neighborhood so that they could document and really feel more embedded in the community, even though we were certainly just piloting, kind of dropping into the neighborhood for the day, but to go out and take images of the neighborhood and kind of understand where we were situated. And that was another interesting learning, because on the one hand we were holding the workshop in a community organization, and we were very welcome to having someone come from off the street and join the workshop, but on the other hand it was a very facilitated process in which it wasn't truly open to the public. I mean, there's the need for time, resources to actually spend your day in a design workshop. We had some people drop in off the street and come look at the exhibition in the space, but they actually didn't want to stay. So, I think that the idea that it's truly open or participatory, on the other hand, is kind of a misnomer. I mean, we know that these things are highly facilitated and curated, and so this one was mostly about exchanging skill sets across the two disciplines. Then the next one I'm going to talk about was held at the annual conference for the Science and Technology Studies Association, and this one engaged in the prototyping of objects known as inquiry machines, using Kat Young-Nickel, her process for creating objects that contain methodologies or theoretical arguments. So we brought people together and we went out scavenging in the neighborhood using found objects to create a set of tools that were intended by academics to be kind of used for their own purposes. So some of them were new ways of looking at the world through a vacuum cleaner pipe, or new ways of listening to the world. And so that was the set of artifacts that we displayed then at the conference the following day. And this one was with teens in Brooklyn that were engaged in an urban health project. And moving on, the next one, this one was with graduate students in science and technology studies also. So there's a big part of this is about translating skill sets from design into science and technology studies and social science, and theories from social science into design. And so this one we actually held at the Harvard's Arnold Arboretum, which is a beautiful natural resource. And we went out with the world's expert on weeds through a tour of the Arboretum, and then came back for 2 days to prototype some ideas related to the findings. And I think I'll show a detailed example of that later. Here it is, sorry. And so this is the bioprosthesis project, was one of the projects that emerged from the workshop, led by Kelly Dobson, who's a RISD designer. And this was a technique for listening to the vibrations in trees, so embedding some microphones in trees so that humans could listen to the vital processes within the trees. So that one I really personally gravitated towards because of my interest in emerging technologies, and especially the Internet of Things and the way digital things can be integrated with physical things. But in this case, a natural resource, and thinking more about that. So what participants in the workshop did is actually they went up and hugged this prosthesis. So it had sort of a foam outside, and so each person would go up and kind of hug it in order to put their ear next to the prosthesis. And it wasn't a fully prototyped project, but the conceptual aspect of it was very interesting. Okay. So the next project I'm going to talk about is a research project that I did with my colleague Anijo Matthew, and it was funded by the Urban Communication Foundation. And this one is related to my interest in urban infrastructure, everything from community-built wireless networks to, sort of Linux and open source, to thinking about the ways in which our urban infrastructure often is quite a black box, especially when we think about the introductions of things like adaptive traffic signals or smart parking meters or congestion pricing, these kinds of systems, or even the solar-powered trash cans that you find cropping up on different corners. So a lot of the decisions about how those urban technologies are deployed, tends to happen within government departments where the decision is not even considered as a political one. It's seen as, purely a simple choice of which vendor has the lowest price and the best available technology to deploy in the city. So that the purpose of the project was to think more about how we could use a participatory process by inviting policymakers, technologists, business entrepreneurs, designers, and social scientists together to think about the future of the neighborhoods that they lived in, where they had the most knowledge of the context, and think about what kinds of values they associated with, their sort of goals for the kind of place they would want to live, and to design a city for 30 years in the future that would bring that set of values into communication with this idea of urban infrastructure. And we held the workshops in 3 different cities, New York, Chicago, and Boston. And the result of the workshop was to create this designing policy toolkit, again, as a visual piece which embodies this argument around how to open up urban infrastructure and urban technology to discuss questions of values and ethics and use a participatory method in which to do that. So it's more of a prompt to policymakers and city officials to think about different ways of hosting or having people participate in discussions. And most recently, the Boston Office on New Urban Mechanics, which is kind of a lab in which they try to prototype and test new ways of engaging with citizens, has actually requested a lot of these toolkits. So I'm hoping that as we start that conversation, that more city policy folks and technology folks will think about the role of values that are embedded in urban infrastructure and how to open up the conversation. So this is just to give you a sense of the different sites that we had. Chicago focused on urban screens and as an interface for cultural content and community curation of content. The New York focused on post-crisis, post-Hurricane Sandy, the economic crisis, and sort of what kinds of new, say, networked objects or Internet of Things types of discussions we could have. And the last one was on technologies of the body in Boston, because Boston has a lot of great medical facilities and hospitals. This one was actually about 1 week after the Boston Marathon bombing, so the mood was very strange, obviously, but the topic's still very relevant, especially given the body and the marathon. So here's a couple of pictures, and I would say that, out of all the workshops that we did, it's not necessarily the specific ideas, because our purpose wasn't trying to use design to create solutions to specific neighborhood problems. We were more looking for the speculative and conceptual conversations around what kinds of new questions should be asked if people are going to be putting themselves in the position of designing urban infrastructures around their values for the future context. So it's really much more about the process that we went through and what seemed to work and what seemed not to work. And again, we can learn a lot from the things that didn't work, the frictions and the tensions and the difficulties we had, which was everything from the concept of designing technology itself can be seen as a very deterministic act, right? And so the idea that we chose technology as a place for this discussion itself could be problematic. So we used a very, everyone I think is quite familiar with some very basic design processes and methods, like moving someone from a conversation to a prototype to a presentation to a critique, and we had some prompts to give people so that they could follow along the process. And we had design facilitators with every group that we worked with, so that meant that they had a way of leading by example and facilitating the conversation rather than doing the design work for the team. But it was very interesting because when we had a city council person from Chicago participating in one workshop, and at the very beginning, she was very much in the mode of ordering other people to do the design work. You move that Lego over here. No, you put that Lego over there. No, you put that Lego over there. And then by the end, she was just getting in there and really wanting to take control and build something for her neighborhood. And so it was very interesting to see that someone, even someone from a very policy background, can change their attitude towards the design processes within that short 2 hours that we were working on the prototyping part. And we had some cards, and also, we had picked some values, so to speak, that we thought were more likely to create a generative discussion. So the ways in which urban technologies are normally discussed is either around efficiency and productivity or about privacy and transparency. And so we felt that those was a very limited conversation. So we wanted to talk about things like romance. Like, how would you design a city if you wanted it to be engineered, so to speak, not for efficiency, but a place where romance can happen? Well, obviously, Barcelona, you already did that, so, but even the choice of the values, obviously, we, come with our own baggage about how we relate to the term, but part of the point was to have the groups tell stories about what those words meant to them and have them use those new frameworks with which to interpret the values. And this was kind of a template that we used for the table so that we could work through the design process, and it provided a scaffolding for the groups to work together. And this is a sort of a human-centered design process that we use often at the Institute of Design, and it's only it stands in as a simplified version, but of course we know the design process rarely follows this kind of process exactly. So usually starting with research and ending up with prototyping, but often you're doing many different things at the same time, or working backwards, or jumping around a bit. So those are some of the tools that we use to support the workshop. And next I'm going to talk about a project from a class on network cities that I ran last fall. And it really started out with the provocation or the prompt that Google or Sergey Brin had invested over $200 million in a cultured meat or bioengineered meat company. And so I proposed this to the students, and they didn't know a lot about critical or speculative design at the beginning of a semester because our school specializes in human-centered design. We're much more focused on the field research tradition of design, so the ethnographic research and the interviews and the prototyping, but very little knowledge about the arts-based approaches that Royal College of Art and others have been working in. So what they managed to do, and inspired, I think, also by Natalie Jeremijenko's work in her extra species dinner clubs, is to create a design event focused around a set of prototypes, or you could say some critical design probes that they created. And these were laid out in an exhibition format, and the dinner party was a place where we could have a conversation to open up policy questions. And so I'll play the video so that you can see, sort of more or less what that event looked like. Oops. Oops. Sorry. Yes. Thank you. Oh, do I have to go to the end again, or? Okay, here we go. Oh, there it is. Okay. There's just a short video. Do I have to do something, or? Oh, okay. Apparently it's being queued up. Thank you. Great. Oh, very good. So the event was called Meetup, as you can see. And there should be some sound.
I mean, it was incredibly exciting just to see physical, material manifestations of this idea.
Seeing cultured meat packaged the same way as the meat I was used to in those styrofoam trays had a really positive emotional association because it reminded me of the foods that were made for me growing up that I can't have anymore, that I've sort of divorced myself from. So it kind of reintroduced those positive feelings about meat, but absent all those ethical, safety, and humanitarian and environmental considerations.
It sounds like science fiction, it's crazy, but to at least explore it and see if it's an alternative.
I wonder if cleanup rituals will change.
I was wondering about that with the meat machine.
Yeah. I was surprised by my reaction to this stuff. Emotionally, I had a very strong reaction against it, and it's irrational. I can't tell. I sat here for like 10 minutes trying to figure out why, and I can't answer why. Food is deeply emotional, and you always have to consider that.
What I love about your exhibit is how much this thing became a cultural discussion. For me, that's fundamentally kind of the issue. This is so interesting. Wow.
It's a cultured eating.
Yeah.
Okay, so you can get an idea. So the people that attended the event were people they had interviewed as part of their research, included the journalist who had first tasted the cultured meat burger, a vegan, 2 food innovators that were in-house at design consultancies in Chicago, a farmer, someone who had recently gotten a disease that really had changed the way he was able to eat. So the conversation actually was supposed to go from about 5 to 7, and we were still there after 10 o'clock at night debating the policy issues around cultured meat. And this is the kind of thing where, industry is rapidly working on how to develop these technologies, but it's not necessarily happening at all in conversation with designers or even with the greater public. So this was the whole idea is to, start to open up those questions as to, well, what is going to happen to cultural rituals around breaking a wishbone at Thanksgiving, or what happens if this becomes a DIY movement and everyone's trying to make meat at home as as part of their cooking processes. So that's more or less what we did. So I hope the projects. Again, at the Institute of Design, we've been focused on human-centered design, and so both participatory design and critical design are quite new practices, and so I hope that the projects I showed gave you a sense of some of the ways in which those design traditions and methods can be combined, and I'm really looking for a discussion. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you, everyone. Just before starting discussing with all of you, or we may start right away, I just want to remark something. I had this impression after listening to all of you. There's this kind of tension between this idea of critical design being something like some method to making a statement on some way of creating a discussion, and something that could be also in the regular, let's say, toolbox of a designer, like creating probes into what could be. Something, let's say, devoid of some kind of very heroic dimension, something that's more day-to-day in the practice of a designer. Yeah, that's my laptop. It will die easily. So basically, how you feel that? Because I have the feeling that, for example, in the original text of Dan and Ravi, there were some aspects that were stressing also this aspect. Just saying, okay, we can do a big statement about the future, the status quo, etc. But here you have cultural proofs as a day-to-day tool to open up discussions and to do a design practice. So this is one of the tensions that I felt while listening to you, right? And the other one is this that Laura was trying also to address, and Luiza too. It's at the end how you get in other people into these kind of discussions. And I will just start to explore these kind of tensions, right, about these frictions, about, okay, just a tool or something else. How you feel about that? I know how some of you feel about that. How I would like also to know how the public feels about this. Who wants to start?
I could start. Okay. Oh, am I mic'd?
Yeah, you always.
Oh, okay. Actually, so I'm going to get my claws out. We do get on. I'm just saying. I was hosting a panel actually a couple of weeks ago, and then the panelists came down and said, "I'm really sorry. I know everyone tweeted it was supposed to be a heated debate, but it wasn't heated enough. So I'm happy to be the get my claws out on this and say that I really disagree. I noted it down about how the action of critiquing itself is an exercise, because I actually, this is when actually Ramon went, the action of critiquing is a tool. I'm like, yes, that's exactly it, because too often where we like to jump on that gun and say, oh, this is so for example, if you're in a workshop and you have these probes, those probes become exhibited as the end products. But no, it's the tools, it's the workshop, it's the conversation with too much wine after 10 o'clock. Those are a lot of the more interesting stuff that happens with the probes. So the probes are there as a potential, the critique is there as a potential, but I think we're too short-sighted if we see it as the end to itself. So Pedro and we had this very interesting debate earlier as well about, I was saying we don't look at the long tail of speculative design enough, the things that happen after the proposal. That initial proposal is probably the blip, but how it's done and how it's mediated and how we talk about it afterwards is so important. Just like this event, if you just looked at the pictures, how much different it would be than if you came and listened to each individual creator talk about it.
Want to comment? Anyone?
Yes. In principle, yes, but I think the question is actually a bit complicated, because conferences and design exhibitions are still very confined and very privileged spaces still. We are right now in a very privileged space. We cannot deny that. And I do agree. I think the conversation, what we were talking earlier, is that the long tail is actually the conversation that happens after the project is done, because designers are actually very good of dodging questions, right? Like, so we do like these, like the Matrix, and I think we have to take responsibility and actually be prepared to answer those questions that concern of the very projects we are starting, but where? And I do think conferences are great for that. Look at what's happening now. Look at what happened in Umeå 2 weeks ago in Sweden. But then again, Sweden, So I think we have to also think how to design those spaces for conversation. I think it's one of the questions that we end our presentation with is, what are those spaces? And whom we are talking to? Are we talking only to designers that can afford a conference and can participate in a conference, have the free time actually to attend a conference? Are we talking to design students, very fresh young people, so they change their minds from the very beginning on? I don't know, I don't have the answers, but I do think that it's more a question of designing the spaces for debate rather than just creating the debate, so I don't know, my 2 cents.
Okay, I have a question for you all as practicing designers. How you decide what's the topic to start a conversation about?
That's an interesting conversation. I mean, I think going also back to the Pedro's feedback, it's so for example, for myself, I do look for these dilemmas, but I usually look for it in what I call as a fringe community. So to advertise my Twitter handle, it's Fringe Joyride, because I find that these communities are sort of the overlooked expertise that could teach us so much. So I do a lot of projects, for example, with workers in the joystick factory, or cat ladies, or conspiracy theorists, or activists protecting the villagers around airports. But what I almost resent quite strongly is using issues that we know exist, such as gender or race, as garnish. Now that I find probably almost repulsive. Now, if they're sort of researched well and looked into, that's one thing. But to put that as an extra tick box, which can happen so very easily, that is actually not solving the problem and probably making it even more of a cliche.
Okay, my experience with trying to open a critical design process with the public so that they get more or less the hunch of what's it about. It's very difficult, right? Because one thing is just to, let's say, engage the community and just be, I don't know, if it's part of it or just kind of part of it in the sense of participants or just, let's say, objects in it, which are a bit different, right? When we try to open these things up, and we have found that there is a difficulty in just getting people to understand how to create the object, to create the conversation. This kind of a meta second step, right? So have you found this kind of difficulties too? Because sometimes people just react to the very superficial aspects of critical design. Like, for example, my experience is people tend to take the humorous part of it. Some of the critical and speculative, more the critical than the speculative design tradition is just to play with irony or to play with some part of humor. And so when you invite people to actually do this, sometimes they get hooked by the humor part. I can just share with you an experience that we had. For us, there was and we decided it was an interesting problem by ourselves, I have to say it like that, without any participation. So it was the problem of what is called hormonal disruptors. So that is actually by factors in the environment, or what you eat or what you drink, sometimes of medication also, you actually get contaminated inside yourself, so to speak, right? So it's called also internal contamination. So this is a very hard problem for us, and it created a strong reaction in us. So we thought, let's see and talk with other people and invite to a conversation about that. But instead of creating the probe ourselves, we decided to create a probe with them after a lot of conversation about giving information, etc. So we went to scientists to give talks and show that we also learn a little more about this. And what we had there is a bunch of people, a group of interesting people that just responded to a call, an open call. We tend to work like that. We do open calls on social media, on different communities. And so they come up to the Mandarina space, and then we started something like Laura was explaining, like kind of a prototyping session to create a probe, right? So, but of course, when you came to think of it, of this kind of problem, I mean, it was something that affects you, but affects also your offspring. I mean, if I am internally contaminated with, I don't know, I don't remember now exactly some of the materials, we pass it on our children. So when you share this kind of information, which is very hard, people tend to react in a way that they, guard themselves. So humor is a very easy way, right, to guard themselves of the horror of this kind of situations. That some of the type of critical design projects tend to work with very complicated problems that have this hard aspect. So one of the things that I share with you is, how have you found this same problem? Because for me it's a problem, because we came some kind of a frivolous image of critical design projects, right? So, and people appropriate the more superficial aspect of it. So do you have, let's say, some rant about this, or how you have? Because yesterday I remember that we were discussing that one thing is humor in a very white way, right? Another thing is kind to create sarcasm so that people can just create this kind of different type of reaction. So have you encountered this type of problem, or how you see it, if it's a problem for you, of course?
Laura, do you have a... Sorry, called you to it. Do you feel... I mean, for me, I feel like speculative design should be making these big complex problems more tangible, more digestible, so you don't get stuck on the extremes, the sensations, and go, yes, no, death threats, God knows what. And really to sort of tap into, well, what if? And it's somewhere in the middle. It feels more like, say, Mad Men than, Game of Thrones, and really kind of plays in the back of your head as you're trying to fall asleep, rather than go, oh, yes, okay, done. But what do you think?
I mean, I think on the one hand, humor, so it sounds like, Ramon, you're saying that humor is easily then dismissed as being frivolous if it's only the humor aspect, but I think we could try to figure out, I think the reason why things are funny is usually because they're very dark as well. So the example that I showed with the dodo bird, I think I heard a few laughs in the audience, and it's because it's, it's sort of scary, but it's kind of funny, but it can also provoke a really rich discussion about why is it that in the United States we only eat, chicken, pork, or beef, and there's all these other potential, ways of eating, whether it's insects or invasive weeds, right? So I think that that's what it hits home. It's like, oh, yeah, and it causes you to open up that question about manufacturing of food, or, So I actually think humor, and also as I mentioned, I had a difficulty with body storming and role playing as a component of a participatory workshop. I think whereas like very serious analytical adults can sometimes be difficult to work with actually, and whereas with the teenagers that I worked with, they were actually very eager to, start making songs and theater and integrate the models into the theater. And I mean, it was just a very different engagement. So I think obviously part of the design process is to try to get into a space where you can, be a bit more free and not try to be rational and get out of your work mode. But some of the most difficult times that I had was with, groups where people just couldn't get out of their own, identity as an architect or as a whoever they were, and they couldn't get into the space of play or humor. So I think that made it very difficult for me. But on the other hand, like I said, that's where to look for the interesting tensions. So
to add something, because there was an interesting question about, again, how to create these kind of spaces for this debate. You were kind of questioning this kind of setting, right? And you can question this kind of setting too, right? So Laura has done a lot of work with spaces that are meant for creativity and work together with people. Could you add something to what you experienced with this kind of processes and which kind of spaces? You were speaking of a space in a very metaphorical words now, perhaps, but in terms of actual physical spaces or places where?
Well, I would say I would go back to the quote that Luiza showed about diversity, right? Because I think diversity is the one of the things that allows for the creation of the, I'm not going to just say creativity and new ideas, but I'm going to say frictions or the tensions, the dissensus, the disagreements. So that having the diversity can lead to that, the negotiation around a topic rather than, for example, a unilateral understanding. So if everyone's coming, it's true that if you're coming from the same background and you have a similar experience, then you may not be open to hearing, what another way of doing things are. So I think that having the diversity, which is one of the keys to those spaces, and whether that's an online space or a physical space, I think having spaces for diversity is important.
Okay, I think there's an important aspect that Pedro and Luiza made, which is about how we can be sure that the interesting or the important people are not left out. I mean, this is something that it has been kind of a question for me for several projects that we've been doing. And sometimes you are never sure if there is someone that could just be affected by what you think it's an interesting, I wouldn't say even problem, it's area or perspective. You don't want them to be outside. So that's for me, it's another problem that probably is not just for speculative and the mix of speculative and participatory design, but it's something that I think we can share. I mean, in the sense that when you want to create open projects, you always have this kind of trepidation. No, I'm leaving someone out, right? And you always do. That's one thing. And the second thing that touches with this idea of privilege, is I think that we could generalize to the whole area of openness. There's something that really bothers me at night sometimes, is that when you really want to create open processes or open design processes specifically, there is this kind of, this hidden bias, you know, that either it's at the beginning or in the process of doing something. I mean, for example, there are some aspects that have to do with technical experience or technical abilities. I don't know, this idea that anyone can be an architect or anyone can be a designer sometimes introduces a real, let's say, differentiation of the ones that are in the know in the beginning and the ones that don't know how to do this at the beginning. How you have tackled with that in your projects? I mean, this is an open question for all of you, because it's something that really worries me. And this strange tension is kind of big. Speaking of dilemmas, this is a big dilemma for when you want to create an open process. How you tackle with that?
I got introduced a phrase by actually Fiona Raby of the Tonga Raby called about someone called God syndrome, and I thought that was really beautifully put. I feel that often in design, and we're put in this space to do something, to solve, that we have to solve the question for everything, that this one thing's meant to have everyone involved, and I think there's a problem to this. Robin Williams approach, that if everyone is for it, then it becomes a cliche. There's certain issues that I won't go into list that, right, we all agree in that, or we all think that's terrible. But if you're just opening these doors that are already open, it's just creating a sensation. It's not even creating a yes or no, it's probably just creating one answer. So how do you open that spectrum out so that you look for the ones where people start to take a bit longer before answering? I think that's the really interesting point, where you create more diversity and you create sort of more of the discussions.
I would also say point of view. I mean, one of the things that I work the hardest to instill in terms of with my students is really having them have a sense of a design philosophy and a point of view. And believe it or not, I mean, even with the Cultured Meat project, there was a tendency to feel like, oh, we don't want to be too critical. And I'm like, so you want to eat cultured meat? So you don't want to be too critical? So having a point of view and a philosophy, and I think some of the writing about co-design has been about the designer moving from expert to facilitator, but I think many people are pushing that even farther and saying the designer should actually be an activist with a point of view. And sort of play that role. And so it's not just a neutral facilitator and letting everyone participate. It's actually a curation and a point of view. And yeah.
Luiza? Yeah, I do think that it's very, very important for us to actually position ourselves. It's what is it? Yeah. We were talking about this yesterday, right? How it's important for us to position ourselves politically, because for instance, now 2 weeks ago at the Design Research Society conference in Umeå, I presented a paper where I propose a feminist speculative design, which is speculative design going for a specific issue, So, because I don't think it even makes sense to try to pretend that we're being neutral, because there's no such thing as neutral. And I mean, I think we can use that for several different things. We can use speculative design to tackle several of those subjects, but it's that we really need to position ourselves.
But I suppose it's like asking a question, and then we did this and this, how do you feel about it? But if you go, we did this and this because I feel like we should do this, how do you feel about it? I think that's a really different dynamic. And I think some of the examples that you were showing that sort of that you worried don't have these positions, I would say that a lot of these examples you picked are more about me and my relationship with technology rather than me and how our society is affected by technology. If you look at those ones, they do have a strong perspective. They do have an undertone that you know is somewhere in the preferable. But as you've seen in that spectrum, there's a really nice spectrum where actually, if you went right in the perfect preferable, perfect futures, it's so daunting, right? And, and then the other end is like, we're in a dystopia. Oh, what are we going to do? But maybe those borders, those bits that, leave a lot more questions to be added, they could be really, really interesting. They could be the ones that have a lot of room to expand.
I think one of the things that's also really exciting right now is the ways in which the social scientists are starting to get really interested in design methods and visual methods. And there are a couple of movements that I'll mention. I mean, one is called Inventive Methods, and there's a book by that name by Nina Wakeford and Celia Lurie. And they're really advocating for, as part of a feminist technology agenda, working in different formats other than what we know as the peer-reviewed journal article, or the book, which are the only two formats that really gain recognition in say, a sociology department, and trying to think about how performance or how workshops or how participatory processes or artifacts or objects or film can be a way of doing a kind of public ethnography, which is another very active community at the moment that's really interested in how ethnography can be a public participatory process. So it seems to me that the things that have been talked about here in the last 2 days and sort of where these other disciplines are, they're kind of really meeting in a place where people are wanting to, meet with city council members or mayors or citizens and have a more engaged kind of research that can use different traditions. I think again, it's drawing from science or psychology or art or ethnography, but can have a different attitude about it, what the purpose of the work is.
I think it's time for you just to ask questions about things that you are interested in or that they are not clear with what we have presented or we are discussing. So, if you have questions, I ask please address to us here.
The guy with the beard.
Jaron.
Hi, thank you so much for this discussion. It was really great, and I think it's a moment in when this is the discussion we should be having, so that was really exciting. And I got a question for Luiza and Pedro. First thing, really love your T-shirt, so, I mean, green core, yeah. And the second thing, I understand the critique you're formulating, and I think it's much needed, but then I'm not so sure I like the solution you arrived to, because somehow you come to like some kind of speculative design, politically correct speculative design. That is, you still use representation as the tool to convey the message, and it doesn't change what I think Laura was sort of hinting towards. That is, I think what this is taking us is a place in which designers are not so central, or at least they're not going to be acting so much as a designer, and they're going to be playing sometimes as activists, sometimes facilitators, sometimes. And I'm really interested in these kind of spaces, which are much more marginal to design as a proper discipline, and in which you're not so concerned about, again, bringing a final prototype that you display in a conference, but places in which representation is not the main issue. And there's an interesting project here in Barcelona, which I think I wanted to share with you. It's called En Torno a la Silla, which is a group of hackers, which they got several problems, mobility problems, and they all use wheelchairs. So they're co-designing their wheelchairs with designers, with hackers, with other people, And when they work together, it's not so clear who is who. But they're still using speculative techniques, sort of, how would it be if we could live in a tree as a way to start designing together. Yeah. And I think that kind of places are very interesting, in which speculative design goes outside academia, goes outside a very sort of confined space in which we all sort of start to know the tricks in the trade, and suddenly we go to places in which, of course, there's other kind of bodies, other kind of shapes, other kind of needs, but we're not prescribing what those bodies should be or what their needs should be, but society already organizing to do things, and we're bringing in knowledge that maybe is needed there. And I think that's a place where I would like speculative design to be heading towards in a way.
I think two things. Perhaps I won't go that deep into the extent of what you said, because there's a lot of interesting stuff, very interesting stuff in what you said. But perhaps just picking up with something that also Luiza commented. Perhaps in our presentation it didn't become clear because it came twice. The representation is actually only the tip of the iceberg. You know, I mean, when I say that we need to do as a representation, of course, what we are advocating for is not to use as a token, because this is blatantly ridiculous, but rather, and I mean, the only thing I can talk about as a living in Europe already turns me into a one minority, right? Non-European. So that's the only thing I can talk about. I cannot talk about race issues. I cannot talk about gender issues. What we're advocating for is that these questions should be taken by designers who can talk about this. So let designers from Latin America speak, let designers from Africa speak, and etc. So representation in that sense is just the tip of the iceberg. And this is what we see as problematic in this first wave of RCA projects, because representation is not even there, you know? So, I mean, it's such a complicated issue that it's not even in the surface, you know? Like, it's not even pointing out in those things. This is one thing. The other thing is actually the use of the term politically correct. I have several problems with these, because the use of the term is usually derogatory, you know, it's usually demeaning. And I think that's not the point, you know. I mean, of course, a preferable future would be boring to speculate, you know, like, because it's just, okay, everything works, everything is beautiful, and we all know that's not likely to happen. But these issues are there. They are there, but at the same time, they are not. We all agree that race, class, gender should be addressed. That's absolutely, we all agree. We all say yes. But are these issues really being discussed on the very top of society? I don't know. I mean, perhaps in some places of the world, yes. But where I come from, no. You know, so that is what's at stake for me. And I think that speculative design is a powerful tool to address, because it's very free in a sense to say what if, you know. But what if we start asking what if questions that really mean futures that we think are at real risk, you know. So that's the one thing. You want to compliment?
Yeah, just to compliment on the representation thing. When we mentioned those projects that we showed, that we did, those were our master projects. And it's funny because that's when we actually first started thinking about those things. Because when we got to the point where we had to actually document the project, that's where it clicked. That's where we started thinking, okay, wait, I'm going to document my project, but why should I have to document it like every single other speculative design project is documented, which is what we talked about, you know, white people, always the same thing. So this is where it first clicked. And now that we're doing our PhD researches, we're trying to go deeper, because that was just the tip of the iceberg, as you said. We were just scratching the surface. Now, what we're doing in both our researches is trying to go a bit deeper. You know, we have the design in times of crisis, which is a scenario that we're creating to situate our projects in. And what else were we talking about? I'm just like a bunch of things. Also, we were talking about representation, and anyway, it's like a bunch of different things.
Now that
we'll come back eventually.
I'm suddenly feeling so Ricky Lake. I'm like, well, I won't even talk about my Chinese joystick factory workers in a representation in a speculative design project. But so for example, when we look at Ghent, we're looking at an extremely privileged community. That's the whole point of it. These are basically what we would have said as whole fooders, and having their vegetarian, nice Brazilian imported tofu to save the world. And this, I think that it's really important to address that, because if you're talking, we're not talking about just solving world issues. We're talking about this is what people are aspiring to, but are what they're aspiring to already becoming passive? So this, I think, is the really interesting question here. And back to the politically polite question. So I made a little confession to the team already. It only came about a couple of days ago. So after, we've been doing this project, there were really interesting things happening. Like, for example, right now, the Health and Safety Board is literally monitoring how the extermination process is being done. And they're finding new ways of, gassing 300 adult geese instead of poisoning them. And I initially prototyped a very big goose plucker that I'd found from the Kentucky chicken farming community, which is essentially like a rotating washing machine with loads of rubber bands in it. And then I linked it onto a cement mixer because, it was nice and strong for my goose. But now, they've got 300 geese. I was like, well, okay, I'm not doing that. Because it's one of the messiest and sort of most, apparently it's really smelly and messy. It really gets in your lungs. We're talking, it's like a mattress, but on a thing. And you need to get rid of it. And nobody wants to do it. So these are the sort of, what I'd say, like the interesting points from a design perspective. But another thing was happening. So what I showed you with the lovely gentleman's left. What I showed you with the cake, with the invasive weeds. Now, so we had a demand for it, and the cake maker was like, right, we do it for this festival, great, you get the weeds, we got the weeds, it's done. But we couldn't sustain it, because in order to get that weed, you need to find it at the right time, you need to get rid of all the fibers, you need to wash it. It's a lot of work to collect it. And she had a full staff to run loads of demanding customers, revenue. So essentially, we had to find someone to supply it. And after about a year, we finally got the Natural Point, which is like the environmental agency that gets rid of the weeds, to supply it. And they said, oh, great, well, we already have a really nice social project. And I was like, right, we'll send our photographer, document it. And so it was a team of disabled people, a lot of autistic people. Apparently, they're very good at spotting patterns, very good at picking weeds. And suddenly, I see the photos, and it doesn't feel so right anymore. I'm saying, are we being exploitative by doing this? Because, you don't have time to do it. Surely someone will. And this is where I felt too scared to even feel scared. Like, oh, I feel wrong about this. Oh, am I feeling wrong for feeling wrong about it? Should I be feeling wrong about it? And this is what happens when we trip up about being too politically correct. And in the end, I went to find this carer for a recently deceased person that started the autism activism movement in the UK with politicians. And she kind of said, these are a lot of the questions that we don't have answers for, and the pressure to solve everything, to have these answers, are making us too scared to delve into it in the first place. So if you don't have an answer, just don't even touch it. And so this is it. A lot of people advised me not to even mention that they were disabled in the first place. And she asked a really good question. She said, so I said, well, it's great because they pick the weeds, the cake maker makes it, and then she gives the cakes back to them. And then, so she went, so they take the cakes, and then they have to go back to their housing to eat it with the others, or are they allowed to eat it in the very expensive venue? And that was one of these interesting stories where speculative design is a platform to have these questions happen. If someone said said this to me without the design part, I probably would have been like, yeah, that is a real issue, and then not really given it any thought, I'll be honest. But suddenly, because it's a part of my design, I feel completely responsible to question that, to ask that.
Oh. No, you first, and then
first, or I go first.
No, you first.
I'm not even sure if what I'm going to say is a question or not, because I think what your presentation touched on, particularly Pedro and Luiza, I'm actually a PhD student in design at Goldsmiths, University of London, which is also a big hub for critical design, very different from the RCA. And I thought that what this entire chat was really touching on was the idea of social design and how that movement is sort of growing as well, because there's a lot of parallels between the two. And 2 weeks ago, I was in Milan at the SCS Italia Conference Science and Technology Studies, presenting a paper on if social design is actually design imperialism and what is the intent of these projects. And there was actually a lot of interest, particularly in feminism and design. And so a lot of STS people were very interested in that. And I think that this is something that is refreshing to hear you say, because often I'm at design conferences and again, it's the white European male that is presenting their ideas of how communities should be based on what the Post-it notes say. You know, and this idea always really bothered me. I have a Master of Arts in Social Design, which I did in the United States. I was the only international student. I'm Canadian. That's why my English is the same as American. And we were in a 99% African-American neighborhood where I felt as though we were observing them like a museum and that we were there to solve the problems. But in reality, what were we... There was the tuition was so expensive that people from the community couldn't actually be part of it, and so I felt very uncomfortable. And I think that designers need to think past design. They need to think of other disciplines. They need to really have a critique of, say, development and anything that they are actually going into before proceeding with these in coming into these communities. And in terms of the whole Eurocentric idea, this is something that I deal with in my own research. I study the idea of the local in design education, particularly in Amman, Jordan. And I think that what all these new design movements are doing is that they're really sort of diminishing other design movements coming from other places in the world. They're not being written about. Everything comes from the West, yet this idea of context within design is completely removed, and everything just becomes this universal sort of one-size-fits-all solution, which I think is very problematic. So in the end, I'm sorry, this isn't a question, it was more of a comment, but...
I can make a comment in response with an example. Again, so at ID, we have only recently started doing more like participatory design, and part of that has been because we have a doctoral student who spent about 7 years working with Ceasefire, which is an anti-gun violence prevention organization that started in the south side of Chicago. And one of the most interesting examples of, I think, what a partnership with a community looks like that could be seen as, a more successful engagement was in a project that she did with several other students. The project was called Design to Engage, and they worked closely with a community organization in Englewood, which is one of the highest crime parts of Chicago. And when the community organization came to the school and said, we've had sociologists, psychologists, education faculty come to our community for years, and they do nothing but survey us and do interviews and observe us, and this is the first time we felt actually included in the research. And so the fact that they spent every weekend together with the intermediary organization, which is a community organization called RAGE, And they worked every weekend and used design methods, but in the end of the day, that organization felt that they had, come along the whole way with the design team. And so, the question I would ask is, who the people that you're designing with, or for, or in partnership with, what is their reaction to the were they actually feeling included or not?
Yep, yeah, I have a question, if I may. I just want to maybe pull back a little bit, back from discussing critical design and political correctness and all that, which I think has been a fascinating discussion to have, among other things that have been talked about in the session. And go back to this putative idea, this possibility that critical design and open design actually might have a productive conversation between them. Because when we first talked about this with Ramon, for me, the fact that critical design had something to provide to open design was obvious because of the nature of critical and speculative design and what it does. I mean, Luiza has talked about making us feel uncomfortable, for instance, and so has Laura. And I think at this stage, probably, of the whole debate about collaboration and openness, beginning to feel a little bit uncomfortable about it might be a very good thing. And critical design could do that for this community that's gathering speed. So for me, that's very obvious that, the answer to that is yes, there's something to be done there. Now, what about the other side? What can the idea of open design, openness, bring to critical design? And I ask that because for me, critical design already comes from a tradition of openness because it's based in this kind of research-based approach to design, which documents the process and is very keen on transparency and so forth. So within the nature of critical design, there is openness and transparency already. Without that, it's not good critical design. So what can this kind of second wave of openness bring to critical design?
I think Thomas gave a really good note that, I don't know where he is, but I wrote in my notes about how to track the monetary issues between this idea of openness. I mean, so openness, we know what it's all about, but there are a lot of problems. How do you track these collaborations that are happening? How do you financially reward people correctly, fairly? And these are a lot of things that we can take into account in speculative and critical design when we also have a problem, as I was saying, of tracking the long tail of it, the actual impact of it. What do you think, guys?
I don't know. The only thing that I can say is to reinforce that, to make it a true open process, I think, because one thing that's been in my head since the talk from Alistair, actually, when he said that architecture is a fragmented profession right now, and I think exactly the same about design, but I think that designers have not yet come to terms with this fact. Design is fragmented. Design is something else. Design is actually very fragile at the moment, and with that, I think that it puts us in a very good position in which I think we can work as facilitators for the design process to become something that everybody knows. One thing that a friend of mine told me once, and it's still in my head, is that we all learn math in school, but we not necessarily become mathematicians. So what's wrong with learning design as part of our process? So I think that design mentality and the design process should be something that is actually open for everybody. So people can tackle their own problems. I don't like the Bonovox attitude of designer going to Africa and saving Africans, they don't need to be saved, They can tackle their own problems. South Americans can tackle their own problems, but design is a means of doing that, and what we can do as designers is actually make this process of designing open. And I think the critical process is something that everybody has embedded as something, if not, it should be, you know, it should be encouraged. And why don't we start teaching critical design for kids? You know,
I strongly disagree with that. I think whereas openness can be sold as something that everyone can do, although I'm always very critical of utopians or dystopians, I don't think everyone should be critical designers. Nothing would get done, right? You need frigging service designers, you need IT, you need web designers. We need to, you know, we need to have a broad spectrum. For God's sakes, I don't think it should be the next banner that everyone should jump on.
No, I'm not saying everybody should say critical designers. I think everybody should think of design methods as a whole, and I think critical thought should be something that everybody should have. In general, as a society,
okay,
you know,
respect that.
I really don't think people should become all critical designers, because that's totalitarianism in a sense, you know. Just to be clear.
Okay, is there any other question? No? Okay, just a little remark. I mean, when we talk with Viviana, one of the things that at La Mandarina Newton we have to try to do is to, let's say, promote critical thinking with people in participatory ways. So I invite you from September on to several sessions we are going to hold there, open to everyone, to discuss this type of things and other ones. And finally, I will thank everyone, the public, the organization, and the presenters here, just to, let's say, respond to our invitation. Well, there's a lot of other things to keep discussing, but I think there will be other spaces to do that, okay? Thank you very much.